Welcome to another episode of Back to Life, Stories of Resilience. I'm your host, Danny Bader, best-selling author, entrepreneur, and a strong source of support for you as you travel this wonderful journey called life. We bring you powerful perspectives from people of all walks of life that have overcome challenges and traveled their own path of resilience to come out the other side and create lives of happiness and fulfillment. You're sure to be inspired and get some great takeaways that you can begin to apply in your life to create more happiness and more fulfillment, because that's what you're here for, right? Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 37 of our Back to Life podcast. You know, in life, I've had two main interests, I think, especially in my adult life. Number one is the human brain and how it functions, and number two is God. Our guest today, Dr. Andrew Newberg, who is the director of research at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health, and also a physician at Jefferson University Hospital in Philadelphia, is our guest, and he studies both of those things. Andrew has been asking questions about reality, truth, and God since he was very young, and he has long been fascinated by the human mind and its complex workings. He's written over 10 books, and while a medical student, he met Dr. Eugene Diakele, who was studying religious experiences. Combining their interest with Andrew's background in neuroscience and brain imaging, they were able to break new theoretical and empirical ground on the relationship between the brain and religion. And you are going to like this conversation. I spoke with Dr. Newberg about kind of a question that I had woven through our whole conversation was, does God live in our brain? He also talks about the parietal lobe, which is a part of your brain that gives us a sense of self-image. And when people go into deep prayer or meditation, that part of the brain goes dark. And it would suggest that we connect with something bigger than self. Also, we talked about what can you do to deal with stress and anxiety? What's healthy for your brain? I asked Dr. Newberg about the difference between religion and spirituality. And I also asked him his definition of soul. So whether you believe in God, whether you used to believe in God and you think maybe you will again, or if you don't, Dr. Newberg has some interesting insight, and I am sure you will enjoy this episode. Hi, everybody, and welcome back then to another episode of our Back to Life podcast. I'm really excited. Today, our guest is Dr. Andrew Newberg, and he studies a lot of things I'm very interested in. So, Dr. Newberg, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on your program.
Oh, absolutely. You know, I came across your work through some books that I've read. You've written quite a few books, and then I followed up with some YouTube channels, some of your talks, and just very, very interesting, the research that you bring back, that you offer people through your work and through your writing. I know you've said oftentimes when you were young and you were growing up, you were very curious and inquisitive. You were asking a lot of questions. What was that all about? What were the questions?
Well, I think, the main thing that kind of was bothersome to me was, why we had people with so many different divergent opinions about what was going on in the world. And of course, it's even more so today, I guess, than even when I was growing up. But, how can we all be looking at the same world, the same pieces of information, yet we have people who are Democrats or Republicans, or we have people who are Jews or Christians or Muslims. And obviously everyone feels very strongly about the opinions that they have and the beliefs that they hold. So I thought, well, ultimately the question is, how do we know what is real? How do we know what reality is all about? And how do we trust whatever it is that we're thinking about inside of our brain to help us understand what's going on out there? And that was really the beginnings of these questions that I had about the nature of reality and how we think about them as human beings. And, to me, I started off in a very scientifically oriented perspective. And I said, well, let me look at the human brain. That's what obviously is the part of ourselves which is doing most of that analysis and helping us to form those ideas and those beliefs. But, and I obviously, science has been a major part of my career and my life. And so I love science, but I also came to realize that science had certain limitations, especially when it comes to some of these very qualitative, consciousness-oriented perspectives on the world. And so I started to study different philosophical approaches and different religious and spiritual approaches and so forth. And then all of that was kind of swirling around me as I got into medical school, and then had the good fortune of meeting two wonderful mentors, one who kind of directed me into the brain imaging world, and then the other who really had also been asking a lot of these same basic questions. And we started to put all these ideas together. And then at one point, the proverbial light bulb went off. And I said, well, wait a minute, if I'm doing all these brain scans looking at Alzheimer's and depression and all that kind of stuff, why can't I use the brain scans to study religious and spiritual beliefs and different practices and experiences? And that's what really kind of propelled this whole field of neurotheology forward, starting about 25, 30 years ago.
Yeah, I like that. So when you were younger growing up asking these questions, was that high school years or even before that?
I mean, it kind of goes back as early as I can remember. I mean, even when I was a little kid, I would go in and I'd kind of wander into my dad's study after I was supposed to be asleep. And I'd been sitting there thinking about what's going on? What is God, and how do we think about it? And
Sure.
So I'd come in and I'd say, I don't understand this. And, my dad was really great because, he didn't say that's a ridiculous question. He didn't say this is the right answer. He said, well, what do you think? And so it kind of, pushed the question back on me, but it really made me start to think about, more. I was encouraged basically to ask those questions and never discouraged from doing that. And in fact, to me, one of the foundations of everything I do has to do with this, passion for inquiry, to just keep asking questions. But yeah, I mean, I remember thinking about this, as early as elementary school. And you had mentioned in the introduction about becoming a doctor and wanting to become a doctor. And, when I was like in first grade, they had in the library, they had a little series of books on the body systems. And I would go and I would take each one out and then I'd go back, and just always been a passion of mine. And it's been fortunate to be able to take advantage of it and to use it to explore the world and explore who we are as human beings.
Yeah, I love it. I know I've had that same calling, and I thought this would be great when I, contacted you to get on the podcast. Here we have a Jewish medical doctor and a Catholic writer, motivational speaker, I guess. So I knew we'd have a blast.
Well, and incidentally, one of my the one mentor who was very instrumental in this whole sort of neurotheology, he was Catholic by background, and actually a very fascinating story. His family were nobility in Rome, and they were involved in one of the abbeys over there, and he was able to trace his father to father lineage back to about 750 AD, and all the run-ins they had with the popes and things like that. So a lot of fun, and he loved Catholic ritual. So, getting to spend time during the different holidays, and he didn't just do Christmas. I mean, he knew every ritual dating back to the late Roman period or whatever, and how it was supposed to be done and all that kind of stuff. So really fun and fascinating.
Yeah, that sounds like a fascinating story right there. You've written quite a few books, and a couple that I read is How God Can Change Your Brain and Words Can Change Your Brain. You've written, how many books have you written? There's quite a few up on
I think we're up to 10 so far.
That's what I look like. Which one's your favorite?
I'll have to take a Seinfeld statement. It's like asking which breath is your favorite.
Right.
But, I enjoy all of them. Part of why I love neurotheology as a concept is that it's very multidisciplinary. So a lot of it is about reaching to where each person is. Mm-hmm. And so when I give a talk, I've given talks at synagogues, I've given talks at churches, I've given talks to atheist groups, I've given talks to psychiatrists, neuroscientists, psychologists, and integrative medicine people. Each discussion is a little different because everybody's coming at the concepts a little bit differently. And that's part of what I really do enjoy. For my own self, because I really love the depth of the thought processes, I usually enjoy the writing of the academically oriented books a little bit more. So I wrote a book called Principles of Neurotheology about 10 years ago now. Right. And, really got into thinking about all the methodological stuff and thinking about, how to design studies and the implications and what this means theologically, and getting into all the theological debates. And so for me, that is more intellectually stimulating, but I love being able to kind of, bring the information to everyone. And because I think there's valuables, I think there's something valuable for everyone. And one of the greatest compliments I ever got was when somebody said to me that they really appreciated what I was doing because they felt like it gave them a new way of thinking about things and a new language that they just didn't have before.
Sure.
Because I think these questions are fundamental for everyone. And, you don't have to be this great philosopher to be, you don't have to be Hegel or
sure. Yeah.
Wittgenstein or Kant or or Aristotle, to ask the question, what is the nature of reality, and to think about it. And I think it's
Sure.
something that everybody really should do. And so sometimes it gets a little bit more academic, but it's great to watch people really kind of struggle, and I mean that in a good way, struggle with these questions, because I think it's really kind of
Right.
the nature of humanity to do that.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Anytime anybody, when I go on my talks or workshops and anybody knows that I had that near death at break, they're all coming up. They want to know, right? What happened on the other side? So that term you use, neurotheology, explain that to the audience here. Probably a lot of people listening have not heard that. What is that?
So neurotheology really is a kind of emerging field. It's something that's been going on maybe for the last 30 years or so. Simply stated, it is the field of scholarship, the field of research that is looking to understand the relationship between our brain and our religious and spiritual selves. As a term, there's a lot of possible terms that we could have kind of thought about. There could be bio-spirituality and neuro-religion and so forth. For whatever reason, neurotheology, I think, kind of sounds the coolest. So that seems to be
a cool word.
stuck. But for it to work as a term, the neuro side needs to be defined very broadly and includes not just neuroscience, but psychology and anthropology and medicine and all the ways we kind of get at the biology of who we are. And then theology, of course, especially with your Catholic upbringing, you understand, it is a very specific discipline.
Oh, sure.
And we can look at theological questions through the lens of the brain. But we're also talking about religious experiences, practices, prayer, rituals, all the different ways in which people are religious and spiritual. So if you keep those defined fairly broadly, then you're talking about a field which has the opportunity to look at a lot of very complex and multidisciplinary questions. And the last thing I'll say about it is, as an idea, as a concept, and as a field, is I always say that neurotheology has to be a kind of a true two-way street. So it's not just science looking at religion, it's not just religion looking at science, but it's the two of them kind of working together, if you will, to kind of understand who we are as people. How do we engage the world around us, and how do we draw from our various religious and spiritual backgrounds, our various kind of science and technological backgrounds, so that we know what to do in the world to address the reality that is around us.
Right. Yeah. And those words, you just stated them right there. And I wanted to ask you about that. A lot of times, and I've heard a lot more in my adult life now, people will say to me, and you've probably heard it, and I'm wondering what your take is, how people separate that. And then I want to get into a little bit more of what happens in our human brain when we have some of these experiences. So a lot of people will say to me, I'm not really religious, I'm more spiritual.
Right.
And I'll often kind of dig in. What do you see there as the difference? Or do you hear people making that, stretching that out a little bit for themselves as well?
Well, in the book Principles of Neurotheology, one of the very first principles is about definitions, which in and of itself is a pretty intriguing issue to have to contend with. And that includes things like defining spirituality and defining religion or religiousness. And in fact, I'd encourage the people listening to go home and, or spend a little time at home and write both of them at the top of a piece of paper and think about how they would define it. There's obviously a lot of overlap. One of the interesting things about these definitions is who should be defining them. Obviously you would get a very different answer to your question about religiousness and spirituality if you're talking to a theologian versus a psychologist versus just a regular person. So that's part of it. And I think that, the other thing that we're starting to do in the context of neurotheology is really try to understand what individual people think. So again, you could go to Thomas Aquinas and try to understand what religion is from his perspective, from the great thinkers and the great theologians. But what do people think? Go to a church and ask 100 people, what do what is it that makes you spiritual? What is it that makes you religious? And with regard to your question, you get sort of a 2x2 grid. So I would say the large majority of people, at least in the United States, maybe about 2/3, would call themselves both spiritual and religious. And that would be kind of traditionally what we would think of as a religious individual.
Right.
The people who are neither, that would be the person who would consider themselves to be an atheist. And then, as you mentioned, there's a growing interest in this spiritual but not religious. So they don't adhere to a formal tradition. Right. They don't call themselves, Catholic or Jewish or whatever, but they're seeking spiritual outlets. They're doing yoga, they're doing meditation, they're taking a walk in the woods. They're trying to understand a little bit more about, the nature of reality around them and how they connect with that, that they haven't had, they're missing in their lives. So there's a search going on, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then, of course, and there's the fourth category, which is an interesting one too, which are the religious but not spiritual. One of the groups that I sometimes think about in that context as an example would be someone who might consider themselves to be sort of culturally Jewish, where they might, keep the Sabbath and keep kosher or something like that, but they don't necessarily believe in God, or they don't believe in, all the tenets of the Bible or whatever.
I see what you mean.
They feel like they should do this as part of their tradition.
Yeah. Yeah. More from a cultural perspective. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. I saw a study, research somewhere, and it said they asked people, do you believe in God? 50% said yes, 50% said no. But the 50% of the people that responded no, 40% of them said, I don't call it God. I believe in something bigger. It's kind of interesting for me, and that's typically when I deal with people. I would say 9 out of 10 people that I talk to do believe in something bigger. Consciousness, energy, spirit, source, the force for the Star Wars people. But that was interesting for me. Now, when we started talking in the beginning of our interview there, you talked about, you were always trying to figure out what was reality and what is reality? What really in the brain, what's real for Danny versus what's real for Dr. Newberg or somebody else? How does the brain kind of say this is real?
Well, that's the $100,000 question. The short answer is I
that's
don't
$1 million question, isn't it?
$1 million, yeah. The short answer is we don't know. The long answer is that people have been trying to tease that out and try to understand it.
Right.
Obviously, a lot has to do with our sensory information that we get from the world. The famous seeing is believing. So if you see an automobile on the street, you say that automobile exists because I see it. If you go over and you put your hand on it, you feel it. Yep. So there's all these sensory elements to it. But what happens if you imagine it? What happens if people who have hallucinations, for example, and they see things that aren't quote unquote there? And of course, a lot of our universe is made up of stuff that we don't see. We don't see atoms. We don't see, ultraviolet rays. We don't see infrared. We see a very limited perception of the world around us. So why do we decide that an atom is real, even though we can't see that? But we don't believe in, little green men running around and making sure that everything in the universe works. Yeah. So, there's certain things that we kind of are okay with. There are certain things that we're not okay with. And so part of it is the sensory, but then part of it is how we process that information and how do we, what quote unquote makes sense to us? How does it feel to us, emotionally, cognitively? To me, one of the interesting examples of this sort of cognitive dissonance is one of the most famous scientists of all was Albert Einstein. And, he really had trouble with quantum mechanics. And, this is a very well-known thing that, he really refused to accept quantum mechanics as being the right way to think about the world and at least on the particle level, and went through great lengths of trying to debunk it. And every time he did it, quantum mechanics proved to be true. And yet he still didn't accept it. So, why not? Here's the greatest scientific mind maybe of all time. And yet he had this blind spot to not accepting something. Why? Was it just didn't make sense to him? And maybe he was right. I don't know. But so far, quantum mechanics is doing a pretty good job. So, that, and then it gets into the religion thing. I mean, how do people, why do people believe in God? What is the quote unquote evidence that they have? How do they accept that evidence? Evidence is a fascinating thing too. I mean, what qualifies as evidence? And of course, if you're a mathematician, you need a different kind of evidence than if you're a physicist or a medical doctor or a philosopher. So there's some really, really interesting issues that come up. And we don't know what ultimately in our brain says this is real. One of the things that my late colleague, this Eugene DeQuilly, who was the Catholic gentleman who I mentioned, he was a psychiatrist and anthropologist by training. And what we talked about, which wasn't a particularly satisfying conclusion, but the last way I'll answer your question, what is real to us is what feels real to us. Yep. And so, when you're asleep and dreaming, you have a dream that may feel incredibly real. And in the dream, you're acting as if that dream is reality. If somebody's chasing you're running in your dream. You wake get up nervous and
out of breath. Yeah.
And you get out of breath. Yeah. But when you wake up, you immediately recognize, for again, unclear reason that the dream state is less real than our everyday reality state.
Mm-hmm.
Now adapt that to the religious or spiritual experiences that people have, the near-death experience that you're mentioning that you had. For the people who have had that experience, not only is it real, but it actually, just like everyday reality is more real than the dream, that spiritual reality is more real than our everyday reality. So what do we do with that? How do we decide what is the real reality? It may come down to a very unexciting answer, which is that it has to do with what just happens to feel real to us.
Sure.
But that's not a very satisfying answer.
Yeah. For a lot of people, it's not. And for obviously for the logical medical scientists, it may not be. For me, it works just fine.
Right.
I had the gift of, having that body stop for 8 minutes or so, according to my friend that was on site. My eyes rolled back, no heart rate, no respiration rate, none of that. And there was definitely an energy, a part of Danny Bader that continued on. So what happens in the brain then, if you can just give us what happens in the brain when we kind of formulate like you said, a belief in God? What parts of the brain are kind of active around that?
Well, again, I'll give you a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is that there are a lot of areas of the brain that can become involved in these experiences.
Right.
Not a surprise. I mean, again, you think about what God is for people. As you said, for some people, it's bigger than what God is, whatever that means. For some people, it's more cognitive. For some people, it's a feeling like love or awe or something like that. So when we think about a concept like God, it really can involve a lot of different aspects of who we are. And there can be the experiential part as well. We feel God, we can feel God in our life or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
So there are a lot of different ways that people can perceive God and understand what God is. And in that regard, lots of different parts of our brain become involved. And even when it comes to the spiritual or mystical experiences that people have, again, we've been arguing over the years that there isn't just one little part of our brain that turns on when you walk into church and experience God, but it engages the entire brain. And in fact, I'm in the Department of Integrative Medicine here at Jefferson, and we know that the brain and the body are intimately connected. So if there's kind of a religious or spiritual part of ourselves, it's all of us. And so, it isn't a surprise when we do brain scans of people that there are a lot of different parts of the brain that wind up turning on. And it depends a little bit, again, if somebody has an emotional perception of God, that they feel God's love, then the emotional centers of our brain turn on and become active, the limbic system. If we feel God as a oneness, as a sort of, universal being that connects everything together, then we have another part of our brain in the back of our head, the parietal lobe, that is affected, because that normally helps us to get our sense of self and spatial representations in the world. And when that becomes altered, we lose our sense of self, and we get this sense of an infinite space or a oneness of all things. And those things are probably very prominent when it comes to these experiences.
Right. Yeah, no, I reference your work with the parietal lobe an awful lot. In the one book I wrote, Back to Life, I have a model called Jackrabbit. One of the principles is be still. What I did is I reflected on what 5 principles was I forced to practice to get through that tragedy of the accident, losing my friend, trying to figure out why I went and why I came back. And one of them, and I'm sure it's influenced through my Catholic upbringing, of be still, right? How many times in the Bible have we heard be still and know that I'm God? It was so interesting when you said, and it was one study where I think Franciscan nuns, and you were really doing brain scans on people who are going into deep meditative prayer.
Right.
And talked about that part of the brain, it shuts down, right? It kind of goes dark.
That's right.
Is that the best way to say it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that silence is what helps that to happen, because so normally if the parietal lobe sort of takes all of your sensory information and helps you to construct that sense of self and the sense of space, then if you deprive that area of information, then you lose your sense of self and you lose that sense of space. So being silent, meditating, on one particular object or idea like God, it sort of blocks out all the other information. And you can actually achieve these kinds of states through a variety of practices. But the common element is that blocking of that input of that information into that area of the brain.
You lose a sense of self. I'm convinced, because after, and your work is just fascinating. After the accident that I had, I went to the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and it was October and it was desolate. It was all closed up in 1992. And I went down there in a very dark place, almost ready, for the act of self-destruction is what I was thinking. I'm convinced that it was the stillness down there in which I'm an extrovert as well, that allowed me to hear something. So I know when we go into that deep meditation, that parietal lobe shuts down. I feel like I was there for a couple of days, and I was drinking way too much too, trying to deal with all the hurt and the stress and everything else.
Right.
But it was really shut down. And I'll tell people that's where because after the accident, I said, you know what, God screwed this up. He's up there. And I kind of had that sense of God being up there, kind of controlling things. And that certainly changed. But it was just that quietness down there. So I think it's really fascinating when you talk about seeing the scans, when they really drop in like that part goes dark. Is there any other part of the brain that's triggered when the parietal lobe goes dark? Does anything else happen?
Well, so again, I mean, it depends on how it happens. Practices like meditation typically activate the frontal lobes, which then cause those kinds of changes to go on in the parietal lobes. But interestingly, when people, really hit those experiences, what we've argued is that the frontal lobes themselves actually start to quiet down. And, the frontal lobes are involved in helping us focus our attention and feeling like we're kind of purposely in charge of what's going on in our lives. And so when that shuts down, we lose that sense. We feel like we're no longer making it happen. It's happening to us. We surrender to the experience, different terms that are used. Right. But that's another important area. But then, you also mentioned one of the things that we see with all of this, all of these kinds of experiences is that they're very multifactorial. So it can be various substances. And you mentioned alcohol, and obviously people have explored the use of different psychedelics and so forth. There's the emotionality of it, the proverbial hitting rock bottom type of thing, where, we see so often many people describe that kind of, that they were ready to end it all. And, that is a common theme for a lot of the people who have these experiences. So the emotionality kind of helps the brain to sort of shut down the cognitive processes. And then, blam, you just have this incredible experience. But, and then once you have the experience, it sets off this whole new cascade of reactions, which are more typically very positive emotional responses, a sense of euphoria, joy, and then these incredible feelings of being, kind of overwhelmed by the experience, the sense of oneness and inclusiveness or connectedness. So there's, some common themes, but then also each person kind of has their own unique elements of the experience. And that one of the things that we talked about in our book, How God Changes Your Brain, is this survey that we did of about 2,000 people who reported to us what these experiences were like and how they occurred. And this is exactly, what we're finding out. So we're getting those real granular details about how people have these experiences. And it's very exciting to see, the uniqueness, but also, where the commonalities are.
How do you define soul? The word soul.
That is another tough word to work on. For some people, it's just about what makes us human. I've been a little concerned when people use it on a more kind of psychological and biological level, although I understand that is part of what it implies, that it's kind of the heart of what we are as human beings. But certainly for those who are religious and spiritual, the soul presumably is some additional thing, that there's some additional energy. There's something supernatural, if you will, that kind of, helps us to connect back to something more, something more than the self, whether it's God or some universal consciousness or something like that. Yeah. So any and all of it is possible. The question is that, how do we experience it? What does happen? And if there is a sort of separate soul, how does it get into our body, interact with our body, and then leave our body? And so, they're really interesting questions. And this is also where neurotheology plays has the opportunity to ask some interesting questions, because part of it is, well, how does your brain actually hit that question? So why does one person think a soul is this sort of supernatural piece to us? Why does somebody else come to the conclusion that it's just, our language and our thought processes that are kind of the biological piece of ourselves? If we have to figure out how an ethereal soul connects with a physical body, how does our brain try to address that? How do we make, those kinds of leaps and jumps, and how do we think about that?
Right.
And again, for me, neurotheology is supposed to be open to all of those ideas. And so we should consider the soul as something that could be either or any or all of those ideas, and then try to explore it and see how people think about it. What happens when people do try to engage their soul in some kind of way, what that means. Is there some way of finding it if it is something which is beyond what is just our physiological processes?
Yeah. So how does that then, I believe in soul, just as you described it, the source of energy. It comes from the divine. And when I left this world, I was joined with it, and it was beautiful. And I can't even describe it because I'm trying to describe supernatural, right? Divine in human words, human experience. What do you say to people when they say, hey, prove God exists? How can I know that God exists? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, again, from a neurotheological perspective, part of the question is, it goes back to one of your earlier questions. Well, how do we assess what's real? How do we decide whether a belief in anything is accurate? And then more specifically, a belief in God. And what kind of evidence or proof is needed is a really important question. One time I was asked about one of the pretty well-known atheists, I think it was Richard Dawkins, because he made this comment that, how can people believe in God when they don't have any evidence that God exists? And I said, well, okay. I said, but if you go to a church and you ask people, do you have evidence that God exists in your life? They'll all tell you yes. They saw God in the birth of their child, in helping them deal with a very traumatic event in their lives, in a sunset, whatever it is. They feel like that's evidence. Now,
all the above for me.
Right, or all the above, right. And now, on the other hand, an atheist may say, well, that's not, they may not accept that as evidence, which is okay, but the point is that, how does one decide what is the appropriate kind of evidence? And in fact, I used to joke with one of my friends who was a, very staunch atheist. And he said, look, if God exists, why doesn't God come down, shake my hand, say, here I am, and believe in me? And he said, then I'll believe. And I said, no, you wouldn't. You would check yourself into a mental institution. Because, your first thought would be, I must be hallucinating this. So, at what point, it's like the old Oh God movies.
Yeah, he would say, Andy hired this actor to come down and do
that. Like in the old Oh God movies, at what point do you have no choice but to accept certain pieces of information as being real? And it's, this is the whole paradigm shift concept. And we really don't know. We don't know what you need in order to convince somebody of, one perspective of reality or another just yet.
Sure.
But it is fascinating to see how people do look at these questions and why people become so definitive in the beliefs that they have. Either way, that to me is in and of itself quite intriguing. We wrote a book called Why We Believe What We Believe. And, one of the basic arguments that we made was that whatever belief system we have, our brain pretty much has to hold on to that because the brain is using that to help us survive in the world. If we believe God exists and that's how we're looking at the world and it works for us and we survive, now here comes somebody else who says, no, you're wrong. Well, we have one of two choices. I mean, either we're right and they're wrong, or they're right and we're wrong. Well, if they're right and we're wrong, then that means that we don't understand the world very well. And that is a very that provokes a lot of anxiety because it means we're not going to do well. We're not going to survive. So it's much easier for our brain to say, no, I've got this figured out. The way I believe is correct. They must be wrong. And of course, this is what ultimately then leads to so much of the anger and stuff that's going on around us today, where, with Republicans and Democrats and so forth.
Oh, gosh.
Because what happens is it's not just that the other person is wrong, but why would they continue to tell me that what their beliefs are if they know they're wrong? They must be evil. And so we get into this whole sort of, it's not just somebody has a different opinion from us, but it is that they are wrong, they are evil, they are, something that should be destroyed. Yeah. And again, we see this on both sides. So, it can go either way, but it is.
And then that's all judgment, right?
Ultimately, right. And part of what we talk about what we try to talk about in our work is to say, look, be aware of your biases, be aware of the beliefs that you hold and recognize your own limitations so that maybe you will have more compassion and understanding of people who come to conclusions that are different from you. It's really just a brain that is trying to cope with the world in some ways. And it just happened, because of its genetics and environment and parents and school and all these things that led up to this moment. It comes to a different conclusion.
Nuns.
Nuns, yeah, absolutely, exactly.
Catholic nuns. Oh man, yeah, I understand that. Yeah, I think like you, spiritual, religious, at all. For me, in my belief system, it should really come back to making you a kinder, more loving person. And that's what I always come back to. When people get into that argument with me where, I have to prove God exists, for me, I share a little bit of my experience and I just say, I don't know. God exists in me, but there is that supernatural element. So you want me to prove tangibly, right, that this exists, and I don't know that I can do that. And then they walk off and say, well, see, there is no God, you're wrong. And I just, I used to argue with them and I don't anymore.
Yeah.
I don't.
Well, again, I mean, part of what I try to really drive a point home, and I don't know if will help you in your future arguments, but
well, I wouldn't call them arguments anymore. It's more of it's just
our brain is so limited.
I'm like, I don't give a shit about what I'm telling you what happened to me, and you can take it for what it's worth.
What I try to tell people is, look, our brain is, first of all, very limited in its abilities to even think about things. And then we have access. I mean, for the people who are listening to this, they have access to the information that's going on in their room. Right. So, when you get into political debates, for example, we don't know what the president is thinking. We don't know what the CIA is thinking. We don't know what, every senator is thinking.
Right.
We know what we're thinking. Right. And so, and I actually made a calculation one time based on the size of the known universe that we have access to about 10 to about the minus 57th percent of information that's out there in the world. And yet somehow we think we understand everything.
Right.
And, it's remarkable to me. And it's amazing we even get up in the morning. I mean, considering how little
times
we know. So we know so little that, to me, I think we have to really acknowledge the limitations that we have and be more empathic and be more compassionate and more understanding when people come to conclusions that are different from us, because they're just looking, it may be that they're just looking at a different chunk of the universe than we are. It's the famous, we talk about this story a lot. It's like flies buzzing around an elephant. One of them says an elephant's a trunk, and another one says it's a tusk, and another one says it's a foot, and another one says it's a tail. Well, they're all right, but they're also all wrong. And none of us see the universe as it fully is. So we're doing the best we can. And that's the best we can hope for. And maybe we should help each other out instead of trying to knock each other down.
Amen to that, Dr. Newberg. Listen, how important then is a belief in something bigger? God, universe. How important is that, do you believe, when people are experiencing stress like we have this past year, when people are getting old and perhaps, a little fearful of old age or death, when depression sets in? So I kind of lumped in any of the struggles that we have, where a lot of times we say, might be in your brain. How do you see a spiritual connection helping people through those tough times?
Well, here's something where there is a fair amount of medical evidence, at least, that people who have, strong belief systems, people who are able to turn to their religious or spiritual systems to help them with coping, help them deal with the stressors and struggles that they may have in life, the loss of a spouse, the dealing with the stressors of a pandemic or whatever, that people do tend to do better with that. It does protect people against depression, anxiety, suicide, and so forth. There are many factors by which that may happen. Some of it is just feeling that there's a positive, there's something positive in the universe. There's an underlying positivity in the universe. So that optimism, that sense that things will get better, that sense of strength in and of itself is valuable. Another interesting piece is, which is very, pragmatic, is that many spiritual traditions, religions, provide a strong social support network. Mm-hmm. If you go to church and you have, your priest, the people who are sitting next to you who tell you that they love you or that they're there to support you and so forth, those are people who all can actually help to, make you feel better and help you to sort of deal with whatever issues and struggles that you have. And so in general, it's positive. There are times where it isn't positive. And this is a whole other area of neurotheology that I've gotten very excited about, although, we haven't really started down this path, but which is the negative side. I just always think of like two situations where, you have somebody who loses a child, for example, in a car accident or whatever. There's one person who turns towards God and says, God is going to help me through this crisis. And then there's another person who turns away from God. Why would God have done that to me?
Sure.
And so what is the difference in the brains of these two individuals that, go in these different directions? And with that in mind, another thing that has developed over time is that people have been looking at different psychotherapeutic interventions that incorporate spiritual elements, religious elements, to help people deal with not only the psychological piece, but the spiritual piece as well. And so if they now think God is punishing them, they work on trying to find a way of helping that person see where their beliefs about God may be causing part of the problem as well. And so people are working on all those different fronts.
Yeah, I do agree so much where you say people either run to their faith or they run away from it. I know after I had my accident, was very much angry at God.
Yeah.
God got this all wrong. And then when I realized that I had to get back to my faith, that was very much a turning point in my journey headed forward. And I have a beautiful brother-in-law that's courageously living with ALS. And I had podcasts with him about 2 years ago. And he said, we thought, he and my sister-in-law, we said we can either run from our faith or to our faith.
Right.
I think that's really important. Just a couple more questions as we wrap up, Doctor. If somebody's listening now and they say, yeah, you know what? I think I have to connect more with spirit, source, God for some strength in these difficult times. What's 2 or 3 things they should be doing? What could they just simply do to start to have more of that connection, more of that experience?
Well, it's a really good question because, there are the practical pieces of this, which is how do people actually do this? There's a couple of things that we talk about. I mean, first of all, we always encourage people to think about their faith tradition, where they came from. And is that something that you can go back to, that you can draw because that is what you grew up with. It's what you're familiar with. And for the most part, a lot of these are very well developed, Catholicism, Judaism. I mean, these have been around for thousands of years. So they work, in the general sense. That doesn't always work for a given person. And maybe, people sometimes will have a near-death experience and they say, it was completely different than my religious tradition. I've got to go in a whole different direction.
Right.
And so, now you have to start thinking about what works for each person. Part of what I encourage people to do, first of all, is to think about what their overall goals are. Is the goal to help them deal with a crisis? Is the goal to achieve some, spiritual connection, to find enlightenment? What are the goals, to just feel more relaxed? So what are your goals? And then to look to, again, at least some of the more well-known approaches, whether they are traditional religions, whether they are, as we were talking about earlier, sort of some of the approaches that are spiritual but not religious, like different yoga or meditation-based groups. Mindfulness is very popular these days.
Sure.
And look into that, read up on it. Obviously we got the internet. So, is the philosophy or the goals in line with what you're trying to do? Mm-hmm. And then to a certain extent, it is a little bit of trial and error. I mean, you sort of make the best decisions that you can with the information and the goals that you have. But then you say, okay, well, I'm going to try this path. Mm-hmm. And then as you go down that path, observe it and watch what you're doing and how you're doing. And if it feels right and it feels good and it's getting you in a direction that's really positive, then you keep going. And if after some reasonable period of time, several months, a year or whatever, you think this just isn't doing it for me, there are thousands of other paths. So, there's a lot of different ways of doing it.
Experiment, right, Doctor?
What's that?
Life is one big experiment.
Well, it really is. I mean, each person does have to find their own path. But I think, you can be intelligent about it and sort of systematic about it. And again, think about what your goals are. Think about what your values are. Think about where you've come from. I mean, obviously, if you were raised Catholic, probably, Islam is not you're just not going to be familiar with that. So it's not like, you might want to look at other Christian, approaches or something like that. But again, you have to sort of think through what may make the most sense for you. Right. And then put a plan in place and try it and then see how it goes.
Yeah. Yeah. And certainly create some stillness, right?
Absolutely. Always.
That parietal lobe kind of just shut down a little bit and see what happens.
That's right. It's the same thing with it's the same thing with the practices, to think about trying different practices and try to different ways of achieving stillness and meditation and prayer and sure. Find the 2 or 3 ones that really work well for you.
Yep. Walks in nature. Yep. I love it.
Walks in nature. Yep.
I love it. That's great. Hey, listen, I have one more question for you before we get out of here. And I certainly, we all appreciate your time and the research that you're putting out into the world. I certainly want to acknowledge that
the work that you're doing, I think, is brilliant, and it's very much needed.
Thank you.
Because this life is not all there is. So you're welcome. Keep up the good work. Where could people go find out a little bit more about you, your speaking, your writing, everything?
Sure. So probably the easiest way to connect with me is through my website, which is just Andrew Newberg, NEWBERG.com.
Okay.
And on there, people actually can find, actual the articles for some of the research, some of the brain scan stuff that we were talking about, information about the books, current, past, and current, and next. Okay. And I always say we're just scratching the surface on this whole thing. So we have a long way to go, and people can connect with me as well. And I do my best to try to respond to them if they have questions or if they're looking for ideas or whatever. So that's the best way to do it.
That's great. That's great. So here's my last question for you, and kind of you'll pull something out of our conversation, I guess. Throughout your whole life now, just not the medical part of your life, if you are with somebody now and you're having lunch with a young person, maybe college student, 20s or whatever, and you're never going to see them again, and they say, hey, Dr. Newberg, what are 2 or 3 things that I should really kind of stay conscious of? What pieces of wisdom, what insights do you have that are going to serve me well on my journey as a human being? What might you offer them?
To me, I think the things that have served me the best, and I mentioned this a little earlier, one of them, which is a passion for inquiry, I say, which is always keep asking questions, never settle for an answer, keep working on it, keep asking questions, no matter how dumb the question sounds, just keep pushing away and keep trying to find, there's a path that you go on by asking questions, and that path is very, very powerful. Right. So that's one. And I think the other one, which we also kind of touched on, which is, we all have to find our own beliefs that work for us. We do have to recognize that those beliefs are our beliefs. As you said, you tell your story, which is great, but each person has to realize that every person has their own genetics, their own, all these different factors and forces that have brought them to where they are today. Mm-hmm. And so it's very likely that they're going to have ideas and beliefs that are different from yours. Sure. And instead of rejecting and being angry and hateful against people who believe something different, let's think about, learn from them. Ask the question, why do you believe that? What is, tell me about it. Let me learn from you. Sure. Doesn't mean you have to change your beliefs to the way they believe, but learn, explore, expand, and be compassionate and empathic about what each person believes, because each of those beliefs has value, even though it may not necessarily have value to you. So I think those 2 things, being always asking questions and always being compassionate, are the 2 main things that if we all could do, maybe we'll get to a better enlightenment for all of us on both an individual as well as a global level.
I love that. I love it. Well, Dr. Newberg, thanks so much for your time. And everybody, thanks for listening to another episode of our Back to Life podcast. And I would trust that from Dr. Newberg's conversation, you'll take 2 or 3 things away that you're going to start to experiment with that will bring you, more resilience, more happiness, more fulfillment, because after all, that is what we're here for. So until next time, be well. I told you that was going to be a great conversation. My guess is that you'll take something away from our conversation, my conversation with Dr. Newberg, and you'll begin to experiment with some things that will bring you more joy and more peace and more happiness and fulfillment and perseverance and resilience, because those are the things we need more in our life. And hey, listen, if you enjoyed that podcast and you like the other ones, the other guests that I have, please go ahead and subscribe to it. Go ahead and post it out to your social media. Share it with a friend if you think they're going through a tough time and this may help them. And also know that if there's anything else that you need, you can check out our website. I do a lot of corporate events, a lot of corporate workshops. I've got the 3 books out there, Back to Life, Abraham's Diner, and I Met Jesus for a Miller Lite. Some good messages in there. And we've also got our Back to Life online course right now, which is comprised of about 29 videos and lessons that you can go through at your own pace. And you can find all of those at www.dannybader.com. So until next time, be well and make sure you focus on your happiness and your fulfillment, because after all, that's what we're here for. And that's a wrap on another episode of Back to Life, Stories of Resilience. Be sure to share this episode with your people and connect with me on my social media platforms. You can also visit www.dannybader.com to get some cool Jackrabbit t-shirts and support the vision to end ALS, as well as my books and my online trainings. So until next time, I am certain the powerful perspectives you heard will inspire you to make some changes to how you think about your life, begin to experiment with some new actions, and create more happiness and fulfillment in your life, because that is what you are here for, right?